Sewol. On April 16, 2014, the ferry Sewol was crossing from Incheon to Jeju Island, South Korea, carrying 476 people, most of them second-year students from Danwon High School in Ansan, on a class trip. Working the passenger decks was Park Ji-young, 22, who was paying her way through college as a part-time crew member. The overnight run to Jeju was one of the most routine ferry crossings in Korea, and the Sewol had made it for years. Investigators later found she'd been illegally modified with extra cabins and was carrying roughly twice her authorized cargo, poorly secured. An inexperienced third mate and helmsman had the bridge that morning. At about 8:49 a.m., the ship took a tight turn in the Mongol Channel. The unsecured cargo slid, and the ferry heeled hard to port and kept listing. At 8:52 a.m., the first distress call came not from the crew, but from a Danwon student, Chae Duk-ha, phoning emergency services from the tilting deck. As the list deepened, the ship's intercom repeatedly told passengers to stay where they were. Many obeyed. Park Ji-young handed out life jackets, one after another, climbed to the next floor when her deck ran out, and told students the crew would stay aboard until every passenger was off. The captain and his bridge crew were among the first people taken off by rescue boats. Video showed him climbing into a rescue craft in his underwear. The ferry rolled and flooded through the morning, and 304 people, most of them 17-year-old students, died inside it. Divers spent months bringing the victims out of the sunken hull. Park Ji-young's body was among the first recovered, and she wasn't wearing a life jacket. Yellow ribbons, the symbol the victims' families adopted, spread across South Korea and marked memorials to the Sewol's dead. Captain Lee Jun-suk was convicted on appeal of murder through willful negligence, and South Korea's Supreme Court upheld his life sentence. Estonia. On the night of September 27, 1994, the ferry Estonia left Tallinn for Stockholm with 989 people aboard, a scheduled overnight crossing of the Baltic Sea. Kent Harstead, a 29-year-old Swede, was aboard for a business conference. The route was a nightly commercial run, through a sea the ship crossed all year. That night, the Baltic was running heavy, and the ferry's bow was sealed by a 50-ton hinged visor. Around 1 a.m., passengers felt heavy metallic bangs from the bow. The visor tore away, pulled open the loading ramp behind it, and let the sea pour onto the enclosed car deck. Investigators later concluded its locking devices had failed under the slamming waves. Within minutes, the ship took a heavy starboard list. On the tilting boat deck, Harstead met Sarah Hedrenius, an 18-year-old trying to free a jammed lifeboat, and offered her a deal. They'd help each other survive, and if they made it, he'd take her to dinner in Stockholm. The Mayday went out at 1:22 a.m. By about 1:50 a.m., under an hour after the first bangs, the Estonia had vanished from radar. 852 people died in the Baltic that night, in the deadliest peacetime shipwreck ever to occur in European waters. Helicopters and nearby ferries pulled 137 survivors from life rafts in the dark, most of them young men who'd reached the open decks in time. Harstead and Hedrenius both lived. They had that dinner. In Tallinn, a black granite monument called the Broken Line went up near the harbor, two arcs reaching toward each other, never meeting, engraved with the names of the dead. The wreck was declared a protected grave by treaty in 1995, and disturbing it is still a criminal offense. When documentary filmmakers sent a robot camera down in 2019, Sweden prosecuted them. The football match. On September 26, 2000, the ferry Express Samina left Piraeus for the Greek islands with 533 people aboard on the evening run to Paros. Her decks mixed Greek families heading home with backpacking tourists island hopping through the Aegean. The Portes Islets outside Parikia, two rocks marked by a lighthouse, were a hazard every ferry on the route cleared with a small course change. The Express Samina was running on autopilot, and what the first officer on duty was doing that night came out at trial. He was watching a televised football match, not the sea ahead. The ship never turned. At 10:12 p.m., she hit the rocks at 18 knots. The impact tore gashes in the hull, the power failed, and the ferry began flooding and listing as passengers scrambled for life jackets in the dark. Fishing boats put out from Parikia into gale-force winds to pull people from the water. At 11:02 p.m., 50 minutes after the strike, the Express Samina went down, and more than 80 people died. The wreck came to rest on the seabed just off the Portes Rocks. The first officer was sentenced to 19 years, cut to under 13 on appeal. The captain got 16. Le Joola. On September 26, 2002, the Senegalese government ferry Le Joola left Ziguinchor for Dakar carrying close to 2,000 people on a ship designed for about 500 passengers. Among them was Mariama Diouf, a young woman 4 months pregnant traveling to the capital. The decks around her were crowded with students heading north for the start of the school year, and with traders carrying their goods to the Dakar markets. The run was the lifeline connecting the Casamance region to the capital, and tickets were cheap and effectively unlimited. That was the problem. The ferry sailed several times over capacity, with uncounted passengers riding the open upper deck. Around 11 p.m. off the coast of the Gambia, she ran into a squall. Top-heavy with people, the ship rolled onto its side within about 5 minutes, trapping most of the passengers inside or under the hull in the dark Atlantic. The capsized ferry stayed afloat through the night, and the first rescuers to reach it were fishermen in pirogues, not rescue ships. At least 1,863 people died by the official count, and rescuers saved just 64. More than 600 women were aboard. One survived, Mariama Diouf. On the bank of the Casamance River in Ziguinchor, where more than half the victims came from, a memorial museum shaped like a ship went up for them. It was the deadliest maritime disaster of the 21st century. Herald of Free Enterprise. On the evening of March 6, 1987, the ferry Herald of Free Enterprise left Zeebrugge, Belgium for Dover at 6:05 p.m., with 539 people aboard, many of them British day trippers. Andrew Parker, a 6'4" bank worker from South London, was crossing with his wife Eleanor and their 12-year-old daughter after a family day out. Loading the cars and closing the bow doors was the most routine job on the ship. There was one problem. The assistant bosun responsible for closing the doors was asleep in his cabin. No one else checked, and the bridge had no warning light to tell the captain either way. The ferry put to sea with her bow doors wide open. As she accelerated past 18 knots, water surged over the open bow sill onto the car deck, tons of it sloshing free. A few feet of loose water spreading across a ferry's car deck can capsize it. Naval architects call it the free surface effect. The Herald lurched 30 degrees, hung for a moment, and rolled onto her side in shallow water, within sight of the port. From first flooding to capsize took about 90 seconds. In the flooded passenger decks, Parker wedged his body across a gap above the rising water, and his wife, his daughter, and some 20 strangers climbed across him to safety. Eleanor crossed first. 193 people died in the freezing water. Divers and crews worked through the night, pulling survivors out through the windows. Parker received the George Medal for gallantry. That spring, survivors and bereaved families filled Canterbury Cathedral for the memorial service, and Parker stood outside it, with the family that had crossed the water on his back. The official inquiry found the operating company infected from top to bottom with the disease of sloppiness, and a corporate manslaughter prosecution collapsed. No one was ever convicted. Princess of the Stars. On the evening of June 20th, 2008, the ferry Princess of the Stars sailed from Manila for Cebu with about 850 people aboard as Typhoon Feng Shen crossed the Philippines. Among the crew was Jose Mary Garbo, a 23-year-old seafarer who'd been trained on emergency drills since maritime school. At nearly 24,000 tons, she was one of the biggest ferries in the country, big enough that the Coast Guard cleared her to sail on the edge of the typhoon after the captain said he'd route away from the storm. Overnight, Feng Shen changed course. The huge ferry steamed almost directly into it. By midday on June 21st, in mountainous seas off Sibuyan Island, she lost engine power and drifted helpless at the height of the typhoon. She capsized in the storm surf. A proper evacuation never happened. Survivors jumped into the sea and drifted for up to 48 hours before reaching help. 814 people died or were never found, and only a few dozen survived. Garbo was one of them, and he credited the drills. The captain was never found. The inquiry later blamed his error of judgment. Divers had to stop recovering bodies within days. The cargo included 10,000 kilograms of the pesticide indosulfan. The whole was declared toxic until salvage crews pulled all 402 drums out months later. The Princess of the Stars belonged to Sulpicio Lines, the same company that had lost the Doña Paz 21 years earlier. It was the company's fourth mass fatality sinking. Market Day. On September 20th, 2018, the small ferry MV Nyerere was crossing Lake Victoria from Bugarora to Ukara Island, Tanzania, loaded with villagers coming home from the weekly market. The Thursday market run was the island's shopping trip, and the deck was packed with people and their goods, sacks of maize, bunches of bananas, bags of cement for house building. The ferry was rated for 101 people. Witness estimates put around 264 aboard that afternoon, plus the cargo. There was no working manifest. No one even knew exactly who was on the boat. As the ferry neared the Ukara dock, passengers crowded to one side, ready to step off. On a badly overloaded boat, a crowd shifting to one side is enough to roll it over. The Nyerere tipped, rolled, and went over just short of the landing. People on the shore watched. 228 people drowned, and divers pulled 41 survivors from the lake. 2 days later, rescuers heard knocking inside the overturned hull and cut the ship's engineer, Alphonse Cherahani, out of an air pocket in the engine room, alive. Tanzania flew its flags at half-mast through 4 days of national mourning, and the government paid for the victims' funerals. It was the country's worst disaster on Lake Victoria since the MV Bukoba went down in 1996, on the same lake for the same reason. Al-Salam Boccaccio, 98. On the night of February 2nd, 2006, the ferry Al-Salam Boccaccio 98 left Dubai, Saudi Arabia, for Safaga, Egypt, carrying about 1,400 people, most of them Egyptian laborers heading home with their savings, some returning from pilgrimage in Mecca. The overnight Red Sea crossing was a commuter run for Egypt's migrant workforce. Within the first hours out of port, a fire broke out below deck. The crew fought it with seawater hoses. The captain kept sailing for Egypt instead of turning back to the nearby Saudi port. Survivor Nabil Zikri put it plainly. The fire started early, but they decided to keep going. She steamed on, burning. The firefighting water pooled on the vehicle deck, and the list grew. Investigators later found the drains were blocked, and the ballast pumped in to correct the tilt only made it worse. Hours into the crossing, she rolled over and sank in minutes, in the dark, without an evacuation. Some survivors spent 18 hours in the water. 1,031 people died. 387 were rescued. Rescue ships took many hours to arrive. For days, hundreds of families besieged the gates of Safaga port, and the lists of the missing posted there became the disaster's lasting image in Egypt. The owner, Mamdou Ismail, flew to London days after the sinking. He was acquitted, then sentenced in absentia to 7 years, then saw the sentence voided on a statute of limitations. He never served a day. Toya Maru. On September 26, 1954, the Japanese railway ferry Toya Maru was to cross the Tsugaru Strait from Hakodate to Aomori, loaded with passengers and rail cars, as Typhoon Marie moved up the Sea of Japan. Among them were 35 American soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division, an advance party headed for a new camp. The crossing had already been canceled once that day for the typhoon. By evening, the weather seemed to lift, and the captain judged the lull to be the storm passing. It was not. He sailed at about 6:40 p.m. into the strongest part of the typhoon. Winds beyond forecast strength caught the ferry in the strait. He dropped anchor to ride it out. The anchor dragged. Waves flooded the vehicle deck, killed the engines, and drove the ship back toward the Hakodate shore. Late that night, the powerless ferry grounded and capsized in the surf off Nanayahama Beach. 1,153 people died by the official count, in water within sight of land. One soldier, 2nd Lieutenant George Vaillancourt, spent his last hours helping others in the water. The Army awarded him the Soldier's Medal posthumously, and his unit dedicated their new camp's football field to him a year later. For days afterward, bodies washed in along the Nanayahama shore. The disaster drove Japan to bore the Seikon Tunnel beneath the strait, the longest undersea railway tunnel in the world. Trains today cross under the water that Toya Maru couldn't survive. Doña Paz. On December 20th, 1987, the ferry Doña Paz was steaming from Tacloban to Manila, packed with families traveling for Christmas. Her declared capacity was about 1,500. The official manifest listed 1,493 passengers, and she carried thousands more through uncounted ticket sales. Paquito Osabel was aboard among the holiday crowds, where whole families shared cots in the passageways for the long run to the capital. The pre-Christmas Manila run was the busiest crossing of the Philippine year. Coming the other way through the Topless Strait that night was the tanker NT Vector, loaded with 8,800 barrels of gasoline and other petroleum products. Investigators would later find the Vector was unseaworthy, running without a license, without a lookout, and without a qualified master. At about 10:30 p.m., the two ships collided. The tanker's cargo ignited and spilled burning fuel across the water, and fire swept through the crowded ferry in the dark. Osabel later put it in one sentence: "I went to a window to see what happened, and I saw the sea in flames." Survivors jumped through fire into a burning sea, swimming past the dead, some clinging to suitcases. Both ships went down within hours, and an estimated 4,385 people died by the count of a later government inquiry. Rescuers found 26 people alive. 24 came off the ferry, and 2 came from the tanker's crew. For days afterward, bodies washed onto the shores of Mindoro, and many of the victims were never identified. Many families learned of the sinking while they waited at the Manila pier for a ship that never arrived. It remains the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history, nearly 3 times the death toll of the Titanic. If you'd like to see more videos like this, subscribe and tell me what to cover next in the comments.